Well, good morning again, everyone, and welcome to the premium track of today's conference. Firstly, welcome all of you for those who may not have been in the previous panel discussion, and of course the keynote from Clint Carr from Click. To introduce you now to Ian Oppermann, Chief Data Scientist at New South Wales Department of Customer Service, who we all know this government organisation is doing absolutely fantastic work in this space. And his keynote will be going into how New South Wales are strengthening their data capability by constructing a data sharing framework across Australian states and the Commonwealth. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Ian to the virtual stage now for his keynote.
And I'm going to have a little bit of fun with you this morning talking about data sharing and use. There is a lot going on in New South Wales. In fact, there's a lot going on across Australia around data sharing and use. New South Wales has the Data Sharing Act, which underpins the Data Analytics Centre. That's up for review. It's 2021. It's up for its statutory review. The Commonwealth is looking at data sharing and use through the Data Availability and Transparency Bill, and that has had a lot of consultation leading up to this point. And of course, there's also an ongoing consultation around the Privacy Act. And ultimately, this is all because data sharing and use will fundamentally underpin the digital economy, a digital government. It fundamentally underpins how we engage with each other, how we're interacting this morning with each other. It's all around data sharing and use. And New South Wales has been accelerating its journey of data sharing and use in concert with some other activities. There has been recently the release of the AI strategy, release of the Smart Places strategy, and all of these are fundamentally underpinned by data sharing and use. And those data sharing and use frameworks really turn out to be really quite complex because of the different contextual situations in which we share data. What I'm going to do this morning is talk you through a little bit of the contextual thinking about the way we're looking at data sharing and use, talk about some of the issues and challenges, and then give you a real world example of, in fact, how we're sharing COVID data as part of increasing situational awareness, increasing understanding of what's happening in New South Wales. And that map you can see on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen is actually a snapshot of the daily COVID map that we put out, which is an example of data sharing and use. But let's get into it. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the future. The future is always fun to talk about because we can imagine, we can dream. And if we pick a date of, for example, 2030, that's also a really good point because the United Nations has done some really quality thinking about what the world might look like in 2030. And there's a couple of things that we absolutely know will be the case in 2030. The world's population will increase. We know that from today's 7.6 billion people, there's an estimated 8.5 billion people going to occupy the planet in 2030, which is only 9 years from now. So a child born today, when they're 9, there'll be an extra 1 billion people. We know that the average age of those 8.5 billion people will be greater than today. We're all living longer. We also know that there will be more people retired compared to working age population by 2030. There's an increase in urbanisation expected. There's a change in the way we engage with employment. There'll be an increase in the number of megacities around the world, so more than 10 million people. And we know that increasingly the dominant industries are services, and in fact, they will be digital services. We also expect the climate to be warmer and changed from today. But what about Australia? What about Australia in 2030? Well, it's a pretty brave person who will pick Australia's population by 2030, but there are some interesting projections and interesting models. But that's in context, of course, of that extra billion people on the planet. We know there will be an increase in autonomous vehicles, and that's just not driverless cars, but we know there'll be an increase in autonomous devices being used in agriculture, being used in industry, being used in hospitality or even healthcare. And we increasingly see these autonomous connected digital devices, these smart devices being deployed in a range of different situations. We know there'll be an increase in telework, teleeducation, telehealth, and we certainly saw that during COVID, a massive uptake of tele capabilities, and we all had to adapt to that very quickly. after the COVID pandemic is finally gone from Australia, it's likely that we'll drop back to some of the old ways of doing things. But that uptake of tele is something we found we really can make work. And again, today's a great example of that. We also expect there will be an increase in smart grids, smart factories. And a smart factory or a smart grid is where we have multi-directional flows of energy, of data, of labor, of power, of effort. And in some cases, in the case of smart grids, for example, we have prosumers starting to arise, which means people who are contributing to the energy in the grid and shaping demand against supply as increasingly we increase our use of energy. So in all of this, we know that Australia's ageing, urbanising population will increasingly live in increasingly dense urban environments, will be increasingly dependent on the delivery of digital services, will be increasingly expecting an improved quality of life. So we have a couple of challenges there. One is that challenge of sustainable intensification, not just in Australia, but all through the world. One is that challenge around the changing ratios of people retired to people working, and that expectation of an improved quality of life. We have not only a sustainable intensification challenge, we also have a productivity challenge. So it's the use of data, the use of digital services, the use of AI, it's unimaginable that we cannot, any other way that we can address that productivity challenge and that sustainable intensification challenge without increasing our use of data, increasing our use of smart. And all of that, as I mentioned, is the world of 2030. And the United Nations has also done some great work thinking about outcomes of the world of 2030 and how we would like globally the world to look. Reduce poverty, no hunger, health and well-being. And one of those UN sustainability goals, which of course Australia has signed up to, is sustainable cities and communities. And all of these outcomes, all of these goals that we're looking towards shaping the world to be like in 2030 are underpinned by use of data, underpinned by the use of smart, and certainly supported by digital connectivity. And again, the world of 2030 used to be a long time in the future. As mentioned, a child born today will be 9 by the time we get to this world of 2030. And of course, it doesn't stop at 2030. The UN has done some really quality work thinking about how the world's population will change over time. By 2050, we're looking at 9.7 billion people. No more land, no more water, an extra 2 billion people on the planet with that aging, urbanising population, with the changing climate, and with an increased challenge of a sustainable intensification. By the end of the century, it's expected to be 11 billion people. And of course, projecting that far in the future is a fraught process. But underpinning all of this is also a couple of other really important technological trends. In my spare time, I work with a research program which was established a couple of years ago to look at 6G mobile communication. We have 5G now. 6G is also planned to land around about 2030. And we know that communications and connectivity, and in particular mobile connectivity, has fundamentally improved the productivity of nations, has lifted people out of poverty, and has helped create markets globally. And that drumbeat of the Gs coming approximately every 10 years means that as we look to 2050, we'll be looking at 8G. By the end of the century, of course, things will be different. But the pervasiveness, the connectivity, the digitization of all of these different aspects of the future economy and our lives are what we really need to be thinking about when we're thinking about data sharing and use. There's a couple of other aspects, of course, as well. As we increasingly depend on digital connected capability and technology in increasingly complex networks, we need to think about a whole range of other aspects. Privacy preserving data sharing is what we're going to focus on today, but there's some other aspects about that future enabled connected complex digital world around the trustworthiness of systems, about how much energy those systems consume. It may get to the point where it's no longer acceptable to spend a proportion of our total global energy budget on data, digital and connectivity as it is today, or at least as it trends today. We need these systems to be guaranteed, we need them to be seamless, we need them to be secure. But it's the privacy preserving part we're going to focus on today. Let me come back to today and using data in the real world to make a difference. So as mentioned, New South Wales has been on quite a data journey for some time. The Data Analytics Centre was created in 2015 and was underpinned by the New South Wales Data Sharing Act for government. And that's what's up for review. The Act is up for review this year. So we're developing a data strategy in anticipation of the renewal of that Act. But over the course of the years, the Data Analytics Centre has done some really amazing things with data, looking at wicked policy challenges, so problems that are complex and subtle and ultimately dependent on people's behaviour. The approach taken over the years has been to reframe the conversation in terms of outcomes, and really ambitious outcomes, irrespective of who has responsibility for driving those outcomes. But thinking about outcomes in terms of language and principles that people can relate to, and building indicators to understand whether or not we're achieving those outcomes, and look at the conversation between the outcomes, the different outcomes in an outcomes framework. But then, really importantly, building the journey of child, family, household, community, business, TRAM, in order to understand all the different points of friction as we move through that journey, and those factors that lead either towards or away from those outcomes. And this approach has been very, very powerful. It helps to reframe the conversation in terms of what we're really trying to achieve. It helps to really build quantifiable measures which may adapt over time towards those outcomes in terms of indicators. And it helps to create really rich data assets that help understand all those points of friction, all the kinks in the system, all those places where things go wrong and services could be delivered differently, or policies could be reformed, or whole systems could be reformed in order to allow that journey to lead to the outcomes that we're after. And over the years, we've worked with domestic and family violence, we've worked with children with out-of-home care, we've worked with transport, we've worked with insurance reform, but in all cases, outcomes, indicators, and rich data assets to help understand that journey of child, household, community. Now we've been putting in place, or in the course of 2020, we've put in place some really important new strategies. One is the Smart Places strategy. So again, the approach here is to talk about outcomes. What do we want to achieve for a smart community? And the outcomes we talk about are in terms of skills, jobs, development, health and well-being, equity, accessibility, inclusion, collaboration, connection. Human principles-based outcomes driven by or measured by indicators, and supported by building those rich data journeys of community, of infrastructure. And the ability to do this comes through the use and sharing of data. The way that Transport for New South Wales looks at their part of smart places and smart cities is through smart infrastructure, a fundamental component that builds towards that smart places thinking and the ability to make a place smart. The view that Transport has is very much the infrastructure is captured in a digital twin, a really important model of how the real infrastructure is going to work. And they use it for planning, for design, to build, to operate and maintain those systems. And that helps roll up into a smart infrastructure environment. And smart means that you can understand what's going on, situational awareness. You can help do what-if scenario planning or root cause analysis or fault detection or even predictive maintenance, because you've got a digital twin of that physical infrastructure that constantly is reinforced by actual data taking place or being generated in the real world, and data sets that have not traditionally been used. So data sets around the environment or the circumstances, the context in which this infrastructure operates. All of that rolls up to the smart cities. And again, we can start to think about where we want to set the dials of those outcomes frameworks in a smart cities or smart places environment. That's the diagram on the left, Transport's pyramid view of the infrastructure and the data interacting constantly to create smart infrastructure and smart cities. The view on the right are the standards that underpin it, or part of the family of standards that underpin this smart infrastructure. And it's fair to say there's still a lot of work to do on the standards side of things in order to give us a full suite, a full family of those high-level strategic standards, process standards, and then the nuts and bolts standards that help us come together. But what it allows is Transport to plan, to construct, to operate, and to maintain the physical infrastructure by constantly moving backwards and forwards. In a smart places context, it allows for situational awareness. What's going on around me now? It allows for root cause analysis. If something is going wrong, what are the factors that help understand what's driving that outcome? It allows for prediction. Once you identify the factors that lead to an outcome, then you can start to look at prediction of different sorts of outcomes with increasing sophistication. But really importantly, allows that what-if scenario planning. What if this happens? What if that happens? Or what if we dial this up or dial that up? New South Wales has also released an AI strategy, and the AI strategy speaks to that increasing generation and use of data. Increasingly, we will use sophisticated algorithms in more and more parts of delivery of government services, even on government itself. But understanding that journey of child, family, household, and New South Wales is specifically looking at some of those journeys through the Department of Customs Service around birth of a child, death of a loved one, getting a job, but a whole series of journeys which allow you to increasingly digitize, join up, connect, and pull the kinks out of that service delivery. But also think about those points of friction where it drives you towards or away from a particular outcome. New South Wales recently showcased a number of AI projects around vulnerability prediction. So those people, rather than being fined by Revenue New South Wales, will be offered alternative pathways if they're predicted to be vulnerable. And the Ministry of Health has done some great work around sepsis prediction. In the case of an emergency department, you walk in, and if it's predicted that you're a sepsis candidate, then you get a different pathway through the emergency department. But all of this ultimately relies on a couple of fundamental principles. The use of AI has to be built on trust. It has to have an ethical framework baked into it, and it has to have practical guidance about how to maintain security of data and to ensure transparency. So the principles underpinning the AI strategy not only are based in or come with an ethical framework, but they also come with a practical how-to guide for people in New South Wales or New South Wales government. But ultimately, it all comes back to data sharing. Now, I mentioned right at the outset that New South Wales is looking at its data sharing strategy right now. The Data Sharing Act is being examined as part of its statutory review. And it may seem like putting the cart before the horse to have an AI strategy and a smart places strategy before having a data sharing strategy. But in fact, AI and smart cities and smart places are really use cases, big use cases, but nonetheless use cases of data sharing and use. It all depends on data sharing. Now I'm going to very quickly talk to you some of the nuts and bolts of the data sharing framework and what we're trying to do about it, and then give you an example of how it's actually being used in practice. So one of the fundamental concerns about data sharing, people-centered data, is that the belief that as you link more data sets together, each of which has a little bit of personal information, even if de-identified, eye color, hair color, shoe size, that eventually you'll get to the point where that level of personal information, a personal information factor, if you like, will cross a threshold where you start to have personally identifiable information. And most legislation around the world is framed in terms of reasonable likelihood of re-identification of an individual in New South Wales, living or dead for the past 30 years. And so this diagram tries to show that linking of data sets, pushing up this personal information factor, getting reasonably close, that's the epsilon, reasonably close to personally identifiable information. And of course, context matters. Context matters so much. And there are an infinite number of possible contextual situations which we try to narrow down to, broadly speaking, 3. One is a closed analytical environment. No data gets in, no data gets out. It's only the machine analyzing. And the question then is could you measure that personal information factor? One environment is where data and insights are released to people, but in a controlled way. You control who sees data and insights and under what circumstances and with what prohibitions for use. And the third contextual situation is when we release to the outside world and you have absolutely no control over who accesses and attempts to link which data sets together. And part of our thinking is actually informed by what's happening in the world of standards. And also what's thinking about the entire data life cycle. And one of the early realizations is if we don't think about every step in that data life cycle, then we really miss frameworks for thinking about what we need to do at which point. So we talk about where we sit at creation, transmission, storage, analysis, reuse, archiving, and potentially deletion of data sets. And all of the extra information we need to carry along on that data lifecycle in order to effectively understand things like data quality or things like chain of provenance or things like chain of custody. And that's really important when we think about appropriate use. On the right-hand side, again, is our conversations with the world of standards. In this case, it's the JTC1 standards. So we've been working with the folks who do the cybersecurity, ISO 27000 series, who many we'll be familiar with, working with data management, interchange, cloud computing, IT service management and governance, and the AI groups in particular, but quite a few other folks, to help inform our thinking about how we build these data sharing frameworks. And we've also been looking at, really, what are the issues around data sharing and use that stop people from sharing data? Now, very often it's because of the Privacy Act argument put forward, the BOTPA argument. I can't share my data with you because it's about people, and under some circumstances, with some context, with some effort, you may be able to re-identify someone. And there, over the course of the last 5.5 years, there are so many stories about concerns around data sharing and use, which are expressed in terms of personal information, but in practice are all about the other issues associated with where you sit in that data sharing lifecycle. Concerns about the subject itself, concerns about data quality, concerns about whether this data is fit for the purpose you want to use it for, concerns about whether or not you've captured enough context, but also concerns about what you do once you've got an insight generated from that data, and what are the potential harms created, and what are the unintended consequences of that use of an insight. And so over the course of the years, we've been trying to map out those concerns, and we're currently at 14, 2 of which really relate to personal information and uniqueness. The other 12 are sensitivities or risks that need to be considered across that data lifecycle. And the reason that in total that there are 14 is because previously there were 13, and before that there were 12. And we've been trying to work through real measures of personal information, a quantifiable measure, and also essentially high, medium, and low for these other sensitivities, and trying to map them to where we sit in that data lifecycle so that we can ensure that we've taken care of the concerns and risks leading up to that step, and then identified what we need to do for that next step, which then makes the job of thinking about the data custodian's role and the considerations at each stage somewhat easier. I mentioned we're working closely with the world of standards, and one of them is to try and identify standards and metadata for data quality, and identifying what that looks like and all the metadata you'd need to carry to get to the point where you're about to feed data into an algorithm. And you can work out whether you've got 91 grade, 95 grade, or 98 grade data fuel for your algorithm, and then what your algorithm will do with that data fuel. And if your algorithm needs 98 and you're feeding it 91 octane data fuel, then understanding what the algorithm will do. So this is clearly work in progress, and there's been great work trying to understand issues around use of data and use of algorithms. And we're trying to understand what data quality is required for each algorithm, and how do you tell, and what qualifications or experience you need to be able to use different grades of data fuel and different grades of data algorithm. But the big one, the really important one, is this personal information factor. And I'm sorry, I've accidentally left a couple of equations on the page, so if you could just avert your eyes, you'll be able to go on with the rest of your day. We really have been working over the last years trying to come up with a measure of personal information in linked de-identified data sets. And the approach we settled on in 2019, working with the Australian Computer Society, with Data 61, with the Bureau of Statistics, with the Institute for Health and Welfare, with every mainland state and territory over those years leading up to 2019, was an entropy-based approach. And it basically goes like this. If you know John Smith is row 2 in a spreadsheet, and you know everything about John Smith except what's in column 2, which might be, for example, day of the year of birth, then before you see that feature, before you see that cell, you might think it's any one of 365 days. So the probability that you get it right is 1 in 365. But once you see it, you know the date. And so that change in probability from 1 in 365 to 1 in 1 is a measurable change in information gain. And the approach we take is the information theoretic approach developed by Claude Shannon in the 1940s, and which fundamentally underpins all modern digital communications, all modern digital storage. So that entry approach basically says the information gain we get when we know that cell value, we can add up all of those information gains for the entire row, and that row information gain, we take the most gain for the most unique person, and that becomes our measure of personal information for that data set. So then we can think about governance models based on whether we've got data which is very personal but not very sensitive, such as Opal card data which is sensitive and not very personal, so it's the sort of things that go into infrastructure planning, data which is used for open data, where we're trying to ensure that we have relatively low levels of personal information and relatively low sensitivities. And then, of course, data associated with domestic and family violence, children at risk of significant harm, which we know is both very sensitive and very personal. So we're looking to build different governance frameworks depending on the inherent level of personal information and the inherent level of sensitivity for those data sets. And during 2019, we were experimenting with these different frameworks with transport and with justice. And then COVID came along. And all of a sudden, we had an obligation to release data about what's going on in the community around me. So I mentioned in smart cities and smart places, coming back to that one of the most fundamental use cases is situational awareness. What's going on around me? What's happening in my suburb? What's happening now? And so the Department of Customer Service, working closely with the Ministry of Health, looked to release data through the data.New South Wales website in complement to what the Ministry of Health was releasing in the data map. And so we looked at what other countries were doing. We looked at New Zealand, we looked at South Korea, we looked at Singapore, and said, these data sets are what these countries, these economies are willing to put out. If we were willing to put that out, how much information are we actually releasing? And we're putting this information out daily, so it has high temporal refresh rate, and we're putting it out at postcode level, so it has a high spatial granularity as well. And so that really is what we mean by situational awareness. So what we did was we looked at the level of personal information in the raw data set, our table 0. We then took measures to protect the data, in this case by breaking the tables apart as opposed to aggregating or suppressing. And every single day, we do this calculation about the personal information factor, the highest row information gain for the entire data set, for every single table, for every single data set we've released in the COVID testing and confirmed data case. And we do the analysis. It used to take almost half a day to do it. It now it's under half an hour to do the analysis of both confirmed and testing. And every day we look at the amount of personal information we're releasing and try to ensure that what we're doing is reducing that personal information measure. So if you see the red curve in the middle of the screen, we take that highest value and ensure that our protected tables have reduced that by a particular ratio. And so if you then look at the right-hand side, what we're trying to do is process the data in a trusted environment and then move that data from that top right-hand quadrant, so governance focused on sensitivity and highly personal information. It's health data, it's sensitive, it's personal information that we're dealing with. And through our protection mechanisms, look to push it down into that bottom left-hand corner so that we can still be transparent, we can still show and release data, and we can then put this out as a raw data set every single day to complement what's happening or help create those COVID maps. So I'm going to leave it there. New South Wales continues on its data sharing and use journey. We are really thinking seriously about all the complexities and issues associated with data sharing and use. We're trying to map all of that complexity to a couple of different governance frameworks based on the concept of how personal the information is and how sensitive it is, and build different governance frameworks at different points through that data lifecycle. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that amazing keynote, Ian. Fantastic insights and really eye-opening stuff, especially when you reference the 9-year-old child. Great to hear about the New South Wales government's data journey, and you're certainly leading a solid data strategy which both private and public enterprise, of course, can learn from. Obviously, there are both massive risks and rewards when it comes to these data sharing partnerships, and I really hope our delegates have now a much more well-rounded view of these arrangements. I personally have never been more excited by these data complexities, but also equally realised little I know, Ian, so I really appreciate you taking the time and taking me back to my Year 12 maths days when you showed me that equation as well, which I think literally you were the only one who could distill down what exactly that equation meant, but I was very impressed nonetheless. So thanks once again, Ian. I would implore all of our delegates now to please jump out of this session and then go into the next studio or the next stage, so to speak, and that will kick off at 10. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you once again, Ian.